Okay, let's get started. I want to thank you all for joining us for this webinar hosted by Soukup Strategic Solutions. We're a nonprofit consultancy assisting organizations with fundraising, marketing, governance, strategic planning, a host of other services dedicated to helping nonprofits maximize their impact. I am your host for the day today. My name is Joe Turner. I also host a podcast called IMPACTability. Please look it up. Please listen to it. We love our podcast. We think it's chock full of great information like today. We have it's on every week. We'd love to have you check it out if you haven't. If you already have, then you're a fan and you're waiting for season 2, which is coming really soon. Anyway, we're coming to you from Southwest Florida, which recently suffered a direct hit from a major hurricane. And that kind of prompted us to put this webinar together to help nonprofits pick up the pieces after a natural disaster. Now, to recap a little bit, Hurricane Ian was a large, destructive Category 4, almost Category 5 hurricane that hit Fort Myers Beach and came northeast into the state. It is said to be the deadliest hurricane to hit the state of Florida since 1935. It caused widespread damage across western Cuba, the southeastern United States, and especially the states of Florida and South Carolina. It has tied with several other storms to become the 5th strongest hurricane on record to make landfall in the continuous U.S. After moving inland, Ian rapidly weakened to a tropical storm, moved back offshore into the Atlantic, and came back onshore into the U.S. again in South Carolina. It became extra tropical shortly after that, weakened over Virginia, and finally it was done on October 2nd. But the devastation it left behind was nothing short of unbelievable. Caused at least 157 fatalities, 146 of those right here in the state of Florida. Caused many nonprofits to shift gears from the fundraising that was already planned to how do we serve our constituents now? How do we serve our community now? Now, I know at least a handful of nonprofits in this area, Southwest Florida alone, that had to cancel their events because the storm either damaged their offices, the venue they were going to use, or both. And how ironic is it that we're having this discussion because we just had Hurricane Nicole come through affecting the east coast of Florida. So now all these problems, what if it was your nonprofit? You may be watching us from a different part of the country and maybe you're not even affected by hurricanes, but what if a different type of natural disaster affected your area? Because they can strike anywhere. Floods, tornadoes, wildfires, earthquakes, pretty much every spot on the map is prone to a natural disaster. So how do you effectively communicate to your constituents after a disaster? How can you change up your fundraising plan after a disaster? Your event is canceled. Now what do you do? How can you plan for the future? Those are the questions we're going to be answering today, and several others as well, including your questions. So use the chat function, put your questions in there, and we'll get to your questions during the course of the webinar. We've got a great panel of guests to join us and help us with this. I'll first introduce Debra Haley. She is a senior consultant with Soukup Strategic Solutions. She's been in the nonprofit sector for many years, most recently as an executive director for the New Horizons of Southwest Florida. Christine Rahill is joining us. She's also an amazing consultant. She's been leading organizational growth as an award-winning philanthropy, marketing, and wealth management executive in the private and nonprofit sectors for more than 25 years. Finally, an old friend of mine, I've known him for many years, Dr. Traina. He has served in public and private nonprofit enterprises for nearly 30 years, an expert in the field of major gifts, and all of our panelists have led their fair share of events, and that's going to come in handy for a good part of our conversation today. So first, welcome. Thank you all for being here today. Now, before we get into the conversation, I did want to do a little housekeeping. All of the attendees right now, you're on mute. If you wish to ask a question, put it in chat, and we'll get to it as we go along. Also, we are recording the webinar. We'll send you a link following the webinar so you can listen to it again, or better yet, share it with your colleagues who you think would benefit from the information we're going to share today. Now, let's get started with Debra. We're going to put you on the spot first. Debra, my question to you, how do we effectively communicate to our constituents after a disaster? I mean, is there a timeline? What are some of the steps that we need to take?
Well, Joe, in terms of communication, it's paramount to get out to your stakeholders what is going on. Some people look at it as, oh no, I don't want to share bad news, but it's absolutely a wonderful opportunity to let everyone know who's interested in your nonprofit and your client base what's going on. So my recommendation is to gather information on what the impact has been to the nonprofit, to the client base, maybe key stakeholders. Put together a communication on your website, by email, get it out to everyone, and put a donate button on there. And particularly getting out to the news media, if there's an article that they may be interested in developing because of what's happened to your client base, that's a great opportunity for visibility. So take advantage of the fact that people are concerned about what's going on following the natural disaster or any type of disaster, and give them the opportunity to respond and to be helpful and supportive.
Lou, what do you think? I mean, especially with major donors, you know, are you communicating with them? How are you? This is how we are. How does that go?
Well, it's not a question of major donors as much as it's really about a major gift plan operation that you have in place. And so to me, it really comes down to making sure you have a kind of a diversified fundraising plan that includes all of the fundraising vehicles as opposed to one or two fundraising vehicles. So you may have organizations that are very good with annual giving, regular giving. They may be good in grants. They may be good in events. And you may have organizations that put much of their fundraising goal. The events might take up a very large portion of that. And so that's going to be tough for those organizations where the plan that they have is heavily emphasized, let's say, on events and annual giving. So it's real important that you have, this is getting back to your question, because you have to have major donors. And so it's really important that you have a major gift fundraising vehicle as part of your fundraising plan, because if you have that major gift fundraising vehicle, you can probably exceed your goal in major gifts to your plan to cover the losses you'll have in other areas such as events. Because once you have a major gift operation in place, you now have a philanthropic donor base that has a relationship that's very strong with the organization. Very different than corporate support, very different than annual giving, and even different than events, because event giving typically is the level of event giving. Right, so right. I think the key to me is a diversified fundraising plan, including all of the fundraising vehicles with greater emphasis on major gifts and major gift operation. Because if you go into the planning process, you know, hurricanes are no longer an act of God. It's something you've got to plan for. And so for me, it comes down to having a strong major gift program and donors and board members that can really pitch in because of the relationship the organization has with the organization to go above the goal that you have major gifts to cover the losses in the other areas.
Right, right. Well, and what I'm interested in is getting in front of it. And Christine, I know you and I have talked many times about, especially in marketing, about getting in front of the news, good or bad. In your opinion, what is that message like when you're telling them, hey, especially your major donors, and you're contacting them saying, this is what happened, and you know, what is that message like?
Well, I think building on what Dr. Traina and Debra have said is when you're talking to major donors, I think it is an opportunity, right? A disaster has created an opportunity for you to reach out to them and see, first of all, how are they doing? How did they personally survive the disaster? How has it affected their business? And then you can talk about how it's affected your nonprofit and how important it is that you still need the support of that donor to continue on with your mission and your programs. So I would start with a phone call, you know, the traditional phone call to your major donors, check in to see how they're doing first, as far as a major donor communication strategy after a disaster.
Yeah, that's an absolutely great plan. Great plan. And Dr. Traina, you were talking about the plans that you have. Maybe you have major gift plan in place right now. And something you and I talked about when we were talking about the webinar, and I want to bring it up because I think a lot of folks will find it interesting and very helpful. You had said that a major gift plan might not be as impacted as an annual giving and other type of plans because they diversify the revenue streams. Can you elaborate on that a little bit?
Well, if you have a major gift program in place, you now have an operation that, and then we use moves management, which is really managing the major gift process or managing the cycle of fundraising. The decisions are made by a small committee that's trying to do best for the donor. It's always about whatever step you take in developing that relationship, you're developing a relationship with the donor in their best interest. And the reality is that folks that are philanthropic find greater meaning in giving back and greater meaning in serving. And so you have so by doing this correctly, you're going to have donors out there that see your organization as an organization they want to make their major gift to. They may also attend your events. They may not, but they may also attend your events, and they may also give to the annual giving program. So the point here is that if you do a good job with this, you're going to have relationships that are so strong with your donor base who are philanthropic that would want to help out, because for them, it's meaningful to them to make a difference with your organization. And it's only because you've done the proper cultivation process in building those relationships over the years. And so to me, it really, I think when you come down to it, to me, it's kind of simple, making sure when you go into the planning process that you look at all the fundraising vehicles that are out there and do a good job with each one of them. And each fundraising vehicle, whether it's annual giving, whether it's grants, whether it's events or major gifts, is very different. You may have a person on staff that's really good at bringing corporate gifts in, but may not be the person that you want out there to build a relationship with the philanthropic community, and vice versa. You can have someone really strong in philanthropic, relationship building, but maybe really terrible at building corporate support, because that's more transactional, more transactional leadership, as opposed to different leadership skills you need to have to work with the major gift community. So I think it really comes down to that. I think it comes down to making sure again, it's maybe simply said, but making sure your portfolio is diversified with all of the fundraising vehicles. And for smaller charities, you don't have to have a significant number of people dealing with major gifts. You can have one really good major gift officer, for an example, that can do an amazing job with major gifts. You may not be able to do as deep a dive as you may want to do, but smaller nonprofits can put together a major gift operation with limited staff, but the kind of staff that really know how to build those relationships in the philanthropic community.
Yeah, well, and I think, Debra, you wanted to add something about how a natural disaster might turn a fundraising plan upside down.
Yes, and it was pretty much directed or addressed by Christine when she talked about reaching out to the major donors. But another dimension to that as well is if you did lose infrastructure that supports your programs, it might be an opportunity, if you've got a campaign going on, it is an opportunity that you work with the board, deciding if you need to address a change in the campaign, work with the major donors as well. I mean, they're just really the silver lining in an event, a natural disaster, any kind of disaster, is that people are definitely wanting to help. So an opportunity to take advantage of that, as long as you can get organized, you can get everybody on board to address the needs that are that have risen because of the natural disaster.
Mm-hmm. Now, Christine, I know that you have a client that had to cancel their event thanks to, I think it was 10 feet of water that came in and affected their venue. So I'm gonna put you on the spot, because I'm sure a lot of nonprofits are probably in similar situation. The event is canceled, Christine. Now what? Because we were expecting, the event, we were expecting money. This was going to be a great fundraiser for us. We're expecting it. We're hoping for it. And now we can't go to the fill in the blank because the place was underwater and they're not going to be back in business for several months. And our event was this week. What do we do?
Yes, and it was truly unfortunate for this nonprofit because it was their third gala in a row that was scheduled in November that was canceled.
Wow.
So they're really rethinking having events during hurricane season as a result. But of course, they, kind of looked into how they could cut their losses on any expenses that were still outstanding on the event, and then went into triage mode, again, reached out to the sponsors that he had either agreed to sponsor or pledged to sponsor. That's again an opportunity, like we discussed earlier, to find out how they're doing and see if they would still support your mission. You can make the case at that point that, look, we still need this revenue because it's either supports a large percentage of our operating budget, or perhaps it was for a special program. And so you have the opportunity to tell them the importance of their gift. You can also remind them that a gift is 100% tax deductible, and that may make a difference as well. And then, of course, once you get sponsors and pledgers, you want to reach out to your ticket purchasers as well and say, look, we're so sorry the event has been canceled again in this case. We sure hope that you'll continue to support our mission by letting us turn your ticket into a straight donation, of which you'll get 100% tax deduction. Mm-hmm. And then after you've done that and captured as much revenue as you can from the event, you want to make sure you thank those donors in a big way, because they've sort of, your heroes for your nonprofit. They've sort of saved your event. And it's, you can tell the world through your social media, through your website, through your newsletter, through email. You could even, if you're, take out a full page ad in the newspaper, perhaps even get that donated to say, thanks to our heroes that helped save our event.
I can just add to that, Joe. A lot of the gifts that come in for sponsorship are corporate gifts, and these are gifts that typically come out of their marketing budget. So they have to get marketing value with their gift. And so in getting back to them, and Christine, you mentioned it, maybe a full page ad in the paper that would give them marketing value. Debra talked about that the last time. But coming up with ways in which you can give organizations that are using their marketing budget where they have to get marketing value, the way you can provide that for them without having to have the event.
Yeah. Now, I know, Debra, you've done a gazillion events, and one of your clients recently had their event in this area, and it was successful. Everything went great. But you've been on both sides of this coin. Is there anything that you want to add to that?
Absolutely. I would say hold the event. Unless the venue has been destroyed, it's not available, I would definitely hold the event, because during a disaster, people want relief. They want to see a fun times, excitement, but at the same time also to know that they're helping. So there's nothing better than keeping that event going and making it happen. And when we did the event, we far exceeded expectations in terms of participation and in terms of amount raised. So it was definitely a testimony to staying the course and holding that event.
So kind of like, would you equate that to like COVID, when things started to get quote unquote back to normal and events started to happen? People are dying to get back to some type of normalcy. Is that what you're saying? Absolutely. Yeah, that's a great point.
Take a break from the
stress
disaster.
If I can add, I agree with Debra 100%. The Ian was unique in that hit our coast, it hit the homes of individuals who are very philanthropic, who maybe not had, especially the condos and so forth. So you may have an exception with Ian if your donor base is pretty much coming from the philanthropic community for that event. You may want to consider making sure they're okay. You're going to get their support. That's going to happen. It might be a postponement. But again, that's just so unique that when you're going to have another hurricane where it hits the way it hit Ian, and it really hit the condos on the Gulf and the homes in Port Royal and downtown and so forth. And so those families are without a place to live. So you got to take that into consideration.
You're absolutely correct.
The event that Deborah's talking about was a huge success. We decided not to postpone it. We were worried about it. It was a different population. It was a population that came from areas that were pretty much okay, and it did really, really well. So I agree with Debra.
Right.
Hold the event unless there's an extreme different example where the attendees are able to come.
Yeah, and the thing is though, with an event like that, you're, as you were saying, Debra, you want to get back to that normalcy. Yeah. But we have to remember natural disasters can happen any place on the planet, because I'm thinking of me growing up in the Midwest. Tornadoes came out of nowhere, and your event could be tomorrow night, and all of a sudden tonight is when, sadly, hopefully it never doesn't happen, but it can. Tornado came through and your hall is gone. I mean, where you were going to have it is gone. So Debra, great ideas on how to, if possible, do it. I like that. So let me switch gears now, since we're at the end of the year. What about annual appeals, that kind of thing? How does, and this question is for Debra, how does the impact of a natural disaster change the landscape of, or the dynamics, I should say, of an annual appeal, end of year appeal, whatever? Should we include that in our end of year appeal?
Indeed. There is, again, that opportunity to communicate and to share what the impact has been. So if you've experienced that disaster and the annual appeal is written, change it and frame it from the standpoint that your work is more needed now than ever. What the impact has been to the client base, get that message out there, and just keep it in front of your stakeholders' eyes and mind that this is a tremendous need and a great time of the year to make that commitment to provide the support.
Yeah, great point. I just want to remind everyone who is attending the webinar, if you have questions, put them in the chat and we'll get to them in just a little bit. We've got a lot more to discuss, so we're going to get right back to it. But if we're not hitting it, please ask your question. We might still hit it on the way, but regardless, we'd love to hear any questions that you might have. Now, Debra, I'm going to go back to you because when it comes to fundraising, I'm also thinking about grants, and you are our grant expert on the panel today. And I understand you told me that there can be grant monies available from like community foundations that following a natural disaster. So how do we tap into those grants that are specifically for recovery from a hurricane or whatever the natural disaster might be?
If you do not have a relationship with your community foundations, would highly recommend that you establish one with or without a disaster. Keep those communications live. And when a disaster hits, immediately reach out to them with what the impact has been to your nonprofit and to your client base. And we just have excellent examples in Florida of the response of community foundations to meeting the need. And they got money out to nonprofits so quickly. It was overwhelming. It was impressive. And just, we were just so thankful that those community foundations were there and were poised to do that. But if you don't know them, if they don't know you, I'm trying to establish that relationship in the middle of a disaster is not optimum. Is not. And the other thing too is to think about in the communication with them. I just lost my train of thought. Oh my gosh. All right, come back to me.
Christine, I think you had something to add to the conversation about grants.
No, I think Debra's hit on a very important thing. Oh, Debra, you want to go back to your point?
Yes, thank you. When you're writing a grant and you have your format that you typically describe your need, but make sure that need now includes the disaster. So you can still keep the original problem that's being addressed, but make sure that the disaster is included in exacerbating the problem.
Yeah, very good point. Very good. And I was looking at some of the questions and answers, and we're talking about how things shift on a dime because of a natural disaster. And it should tell us all to be ready. I mean, that should actually be part of the conversation when you're planning an event. What if? God forbid, obviously, but what if? And I want to give a shout out to Amy White. She says this is right up the alley that we're talking about. We had the exact thing happen to us. Sanibel Island was to be island-wide 41st annual event, ended up pivoting all those who already gave to see about shifting the support to hurricane recovery. Brilliant. But she says our challenge was this. It was restaurant-based, and all of the restaurants were destroyed. So asking them to still give wasn't possible. And of course, she brings up sensitivity issue. Everyone who would have supported was devastated as well. So that is definitely, Amy, thank you. That is such a great point, that we should be cognizant of the fact that the giving community, and I think, Lou, you were talking about corporate gifts, the corporate or the company or the restaurant, they might have been wiped off the map with 18-foot storm surge that we saw here in Southwest Florida with this hurricane and several other natural disasters that happened. So you got to be able to shift on a dime, and what do you do? So Amy, thank you so much, and really best of luck to you, and we hope things turn around and get better for you all. The devastation out there was unbelievable, and everyone who is, regardless of where you're located, natural disaster comes out of nowhere, and the great thing is, and I think our nonprofits come to the forefront when they're hitting the ground. They're ready to help. They do that every day, but now they're really stepping forward. And it's a nice way. I know, Christine, if you'd agree with me on this, but it's kind of a nice way to give your nonprofit a little marketing spotlight, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely. And it's just another way to engage with your donors, your volunteers, everybody that cares about your organization.
Yeah, absolutely. So now,
Jim?
Yeah, I'm sorry. Go ahead, Dr. Traina.
I just want to make sure I don't lose this. The leadership of the organization really needs to look within their organization and the staff, and it's really about the culture of the organization. So if you have an organization that really works hard at developing a culture that's positive and a culture that embraces change, that's important to have that culture when you're going through times that we're going through, where we have these events that are taking place. I mean, it's the change is really scary today, and so we have to, in the planning process, embrace the fact that the organizations must adapt to change, and particularly the kinds of changes that could be traumatic, such as major events. And so organizations really need to work hard at making sure they develop a culture that's very positive with their employee base. A lot of emotional intelligence, at the top level, working with staff. It's not just about your donors; it's also about those that serve you, your human resources and your teams. And so, organizations that have a positive culture, learning culture, organizations that have done a really good job diversifying their fundraising plan, strong boards, they're going to come out of this strong. Whatever hits them, they're going to come out of it strong. And so I think that the challenge for most executive teams and the executive directors, CEOs, is really a big challenge today as we're dealing with these events that are taking place and will continue to take place.
I got a great question from Nicole Karate. Nicole, fantastic question. I'm going to put it to the panel. Should virtual and in-person options now always be part of the discussion going forward with any organization? Debra, I'm going to send it to you first. What do you think? That is a great point. I love that. Thank you, Nicole.
I'm assuming you're talking about a virtual gala or a virtual event.
Exactly.
I dealt with a virtual event, several of them during COVID. And while it's doable, it's not optimum. And so that could be definitely a plan B for an event, but always the enthusiasm that's in a room when you get donors, supporters, clients together, you just can't beat it.
Yeah, obviously, I mean, I couldn't agree with you more. I mean, just being there, that's so electric in that. But
Yeah.
I think that to Nicole's point, it might be a plan B. And again, I
Absolutely.
think it lends itself to that discussion when you're putting those plans together 6 months, 9 months before the event. What if? And Christine, again, I go back to your client. What if? And should that have been part of the conversation? It's something that totally no one had expected, but it happened.
Yes, and we didn't really get into the fact that you can raise so much money at the event. We talked about ticket sales and sponsorships, but you do still have the opportunity by having the event, whether it's virtual or in person, to capture those, auction dollars, the raised for the program, fund a program. So, I mean, that's why it's important. I think in this day and age, we just have to have that plan B ready.
Yeah. Yeah. And this kind of lends itself into a question that I had, and it's kind of been answered, but I want to see if there's any additional ideas for those who live in hurricane-prone areas, tornado alleys, wildfire hotspots, flooding areas. Let me ask you, Christina, should we be figuring this into the equation moving forward? And does it hurt to have just someone be that naysayer to say, hey, this could happen? I mean, you kind of answered that question, but I'm wondering, is that part of the whole plan, marketing, fundraising, a part of the plan of your event?
Yes, and I think you have to build it out based on your contractual requirements, first of all, right? Hopefully you can build into your contracts the event of a natural disaster that you can exit them without any expense. But I think you really, like you said, if you're planning 12 months out for your event, you've got to, what is our drop dead date, that we are going to pull the contracts and switch to virtual, or just not host the event, or postpone the event till the following season. But I think you're right. We just all have to build that into the planning process from the beginning, and including how it will be communicated out to all of the folks that you've been communicating about the event to, having like that communication ready of what the pivot's going to be.
And I know, again, Debra, and I keep picking on you, but I know you've done so many events, and I'm thinking about, should this be part of a risk management plan for your event?
Absolutely. And we've talked about earlier about an overall risk management plan for the organization, which many nonprofits who are doing an audit have to have. And part of that risk management is addressing the finances and what happens if one of your major revenue sources blows up, i.e. an event, i.e. from a disaster. What is the plan to mitigate that impact? And I think that's really a board of directors issue. There needs to be brainstorming around that. There needs to be an agreement. And as everyone's mentioned, you have to pivot quickly. And if the board has already addressed this, is in agreement, that allows the executive director to do just that, to get out there and make the changes that are needed. So definitely consider that risk management plan, whether it's required by an audit or not.
Yeah. And Dr. Traina, earlier you were talking about the overall master plan, that your fundraising plan for the year, maybe 3 years, 5 years, because you're in a major gifts campaign, a capital campaign, if you will. But all of a sudden, this kind of throws a wrench in the works. So I'm thinking, how does this shifting of gears affect a current campaign? If it does, is it like critical needs versus campaign goal? Can you speak to that a little bit?
It depends on your campaign. If you're in a campaign, whether it be a comprehensive campaign for the organization or a capital campaign, you're going to stay the course. You're just going to stay the course, and so I don't see that changing. But in the planning process, you've got to think about that we're going to have, every organization is going to deal with change, but we're now looking at extreme change. And so I think going into the planning process, you have to do some forecasting. and you have to look at the major trends. You have to look at local trends that affect your particular industry, and you have to forecast the interplay of those trends out to kind of get a viewpoint. If you didn't have an event, what the world would look like 3 years from now, 5 years from now. Then you have to take a look at it and say, okay, if there is a major event, if it is extreme, what do we do? What are the options that we have? Capital campaign, you may say, maybe this building where the education center we're looking to build, maybe that, that should be something that we could build in a way where it becomes a place where people can go during an event, a shelter, if you will. And suddenly you now have an education / shelter, because you're planning that this is probably going to happen. So, but you have to start with making sure before you come up with the assumptions that provide the evidence for your organizational goals, you have to do forecasting. And once you do forecasting, then you add in that component of what if happens for each one of those fundraising vehicles in the operational areas. To me, it means things like spending more time with your board, making sure you treat your board the way you treat your donors, making sure that you really understand, know what success means to your board, how they feel about their board accomplishments, and they feel pride with that. Everything that I guess what I'm saying is you really need to make sure you build an organization that has this real positive culture where everybody's really excited about the future, because the future is guided by a lot of evidence and the forecasting you do and the work that you do with it. And when the what if happens and the extreme event takes place, these organizations are going to find a way to get through it and come through it stronger.
Right.
So the organizational process is key to all of this. Yeah, you can have a very good major gift program, and you can go to your donors if you built those relationships with, and you can exceed that fundraising goal you have for major gifts, maybe cover some of the losses in the other areas. But to me, it's more about the strength of the organization and how you do the proper planning to make sure you do that right. And I'm getting into an area maybe you didn't want to get into, but it really does come down to the strength of the organization and the planning process.
Absolutely.
And the culture of the organization.
Yeah. And I think to Debra's point earlier when she was talking about the board as well, and how, this is a great way to engage your board to really kind of step up and be leaders in the community as being part of the fill in the blank nonprofit, right, Debra?
Absolutely. And that's, this is kind of now another side of all of this discussion.
Well connected.
Yes, but the board can be just absolutely invaluable in a time of disaster to understanding what's going on in the community at a leadership level and being able to connect you. And we talked about reaching out to major donors. As an executive director, you may not have all of those strong personal relationships. Hopefully you do, but if not, you should be turning to the board and asking them to make that phone call to a major donor, checking in with them, see how they're doing, talk to them about what's going on within the nonprofit. So use that board as an extension of the executive director to help with the communications and help with the pivoting.
Yeah, leverage those relationships with your board. And I know, Christine, you've worked with a lot of boards over the years. What would you say about that in terms of bringing them? They really can take a leadership role here and really, ignite the community, especially with their groups, their inner circles, but then together as a board, really just ignite the community on rebuilding and making sure that things continue to be prosperous for the nonprofit.
Absolutely, Joe. And in the case of the nonprofit we talked about earlier, the step one was for the executive director to go to each of the board members and say, okay, time for your give or get. We canceled the gala, so we need you to step up here, right? But then beyond that, if there isn't going to be this major event, maybe there's some intimate events that you could ask the board to host for you in the aftermath in the coming months, and bringing in their friends and major prospects that could help you meet the gap that you've missed by not having your gala as well.
Mm-hmm. Fantastic.
Yeah. And Joe, I'd like to add to that. I would treat, again, I said, I would treat the board members the way I would treat my major donors. And so I want to make sure that my board members find meaning in their service. I want to make sure that my board members find meaning in their giving. And so in the planning process, I would make sure that's in there. I want to make sure that the board members feel valued, and as opposed to, because we are asking a lot of other board members. So sometimes you just have to stop and sit down with them. Maybe it's a one-on-one conversation, and talk about, their service and what are they most proud of in terms of their board accomplishments, and what are they most proud of in terms of the accomplishments they've made as an individual on the board, and what can we be doing to make sure that their meaning for service and giving is more valuable to them. We do the same thing with our donors. Why not do it with our board members? And so when you get into a major event like this, where you really have to count on their leadership, you can go to them and say, okay, let's make something great happen here. Let's address the problem we're having. And the ones that find meaning in their service and giving back are the ones that are going to be the most help to you, just like your donors will.
Agreed.
We often forget about that with our donors. So I know whenever I go into the planning process, I always make sure that we address how we deal with our board directors.
And one group we haven't discussed yet, and I'm going to go back to Debra for this, because Debra, you and I did a podcast about volunteers.
Oh, yes.
And let's face it. I mean, especially with an impact like we had here in Southwest Florida with Hurricane Ian, but regardless of what the natural disaster is, what do you do when all of a sudden, your volunteers can't help you, and they might be there day after day just for the day-to-day operation, let alone anything else. And now all of a sudden, half of them are gone, or more of them are gone, because they've got to worry about their situation, their home, their property, whatever. Debra, what do you do?
Oh, that's a crazy time.
Yeah.
And that is definitely where, again, you need to have your risk management plan about how you're going to address. Let's say that you lose half of your donors, or not donors, I'm sorry, volunteers. But again, that goes back to communication is, how many donors or how many volunteers do you have? How do you communicate with them, and making sure that you're getting out to them quickly what's going on with the nonprofit? Are they still needed? Are they off for a period of time because there's no clients that are being served because the disaster is so extensive? So there's so many variables, but your volunteers, some may donate, some may just volunteer, but that volunteer base is so critical because it's a stepping stone to your nonprofit leadership. So you need to be very careful in communicating with them. And I would have a segmented communication. You can have one that goes out broadly to all of your stakeholders, but you should have one specifically and heartfelt, down to just friendships about what is going on with your volunteers, what's going on with your nonprofit and your clients, and getting an open communication there so that they're informed. And there's nothing worse than a volunteer being asked how their nonprofit's doing and they can't answer that. Don't put them in that position, because they feel really bad, and it doesn't look good for the nonprofit.
Yeah, communication 101. I couldn't agree with you more, Debra. And it's funny you brought that up, because one of the questions we have, and again, if you have questions you'd like to ask of our panelists, just put them in the Q&A section and we'll grab onto them, because we're going to segue over to some questions now. Maria Breston, she says, how do we check in with our donors on their well-being without making our communications solely about our needs? Nice. There's a balance there. Christine, you're smiling, so I know you're thinking what I'm thinking. Go ahead.
Well, and we talked a little bit about this, and the first question is to ask how they're doing, the donor or the sponsor or the board member, and then maybe how it has affected their family or their business. And, obviously you're going to have to pivot. If it's really devastated their business and their family, you're probably not going to ask them for a gift. It's all about timing, right? And timing is everything. So you want to be there for them and support them, and think about coming back at another time for somebody like that. But for somebody who didn't have an effect as a result of the natural disaster, then you can pivot and say, oh gosh, so glad to hear you did all right. Here's how the disaster affected us. Let me just tell you about that. So I think you just have to be very sensitive and listen well to what you're hearing from your donors. But I see Debra shaking her head. Maybe she's got more to add there.
Christina, I just want to foot stomp that. It is definitely, and Joe or Lou mentioned this earlier, emotional intelligent, listening very carefully and making your conversation focused around what you're hearing, what the feedback is. But again, your major donors, they want to help if they can.
Mhm.
I was just working with a vendor for an event, and the community in which they live was hard hit, but their house was untouched. So when we came in to communicate how things were going, there was an offer put on the table that their fee would be reduced just because they felt so good about what we were doing and how well they had fared. And it was amazing. It was jaw-dropping. So it's always, always just that gentle, considerate conversation to learn and to give.
I think again, it goes back to having a really good major gift operation in place, because if you do have that, you already have the relationship built with the donor. That's already there. The hardest part is the acquisition of getting over that we're all dealing with acquisition, cultivation and giving, and as opposed to generation giving, where you have the trust of the organization goes back to the grandfather or something. But once you establish the trust with that donor, and where the officer has that relationship with the donor, making that phone call is a lot easier than if you don't have a strong relationship with them, obviously. So if you do a good job with major gifts and you truly have that operation in place, you're going to have your major gift officer or the major gift officer having a very strong relationship with that donor, where it's going to come across, the conversation is going to come across very genuine, and so that's not going to be an issue as it would be if you don't have that strong relationship built. So again, it goes back to a major gift operation that has those kinds of relationships between the major gift officer and their donors.
Agreed. So you kind of are segueing into a question that we just got. How do you manage fundraising for new unexpected expenses like damages and critical needs versus your regular operating expenses without exhausting your donor base? Wow, that's good. We worry about pulling our donors into disaster response funding, which may leave deficits in our ongoing operational funding needs. I'm going to open that up to the panel. That is such a great question. Debra, you want to take a crack at that one?
I've got a couple of ideas, and there's many other options out there, but one is make sure you have an operating reserve. It's a nonprofit best practice to have 6 months operating reserve. Boy, make that a goal to get there with your board, with your finance committee. And then the other one is to look at how your endowment is structured. And in a case of a very serious emergency where the entire community is hit, look at if you can tap into that for a period of time. And then beyond that, look if there are those grants from the community foundations that will help you to see you through this time.
Yeah,
I think that's a great answer. And so the individual donor who gives major gifts has their preference and way of giving. And I've come across donors that their preference is the reserve account. That's where they want their gift to go. So again, if you have a really good major gift officer who's working with the donor community, they're going to know the ways that donors prefer to give. So if it comes down to reserve, and that should be in the plan, right? You need to have that. You can go to those donors that prefer giving to maybe an endowment, maybe giving to the reserve. But I've always come across donors that say, I really like my money to go to the reserve account. And if you ask why, they always have a story that tells why. They served on boards where the reserve account was so critical, and how it mattered in times of change and need. So again, I just double down on Debra's comment that reserve account is really key. And by the way, when you tell donors that you have a reserve account and we're getting through this, they're going to say, well, you're a strong organization, one that I want to support.
Yeah, I was going to say that, because that just shows you're planning for a rainy day. And it was a really rainy day here in Fort Myers, Naples area of Florida a month or so ago. And as a result, a lot of shifting going on. We have time for another question or two. If anyone in our viewing audience wants to add one more question to the panel, definitely would like to take that. We do have a couple seconds here left. But again, I just want to take the time to thank you all and most importantly, recognize the nonprofits for having to shift gears, especially, you know, Christine, your client that we talked about earlier, having to shift gears from everything's going well, we're raising funds, we got the event coming up, or we're doing this, doing that, to all of a sudden, everything has changed. And I'm thinking about the comment we had earlier, the Sanibel Island issue, where pretty much the entire island was devastated. Fort Myers Beach, that area devastated as well. And so many communities, a tornado comes through, it can just level so much of your community that it's hard to pick up the pieces, literally and figuratively. And I say that because I think we need to use that as a salute to the nonprofits who are, you know, they're pulling up the bootstraps and they're getting into it and they're getting things done for their community every day, not just in times of tragedy, but every other day as well. And a salute to all of our nonprofits. I want to thank once again our panelists for their expertise today, Debra Haley, Christine Rahill, Dr. Lou Traina. Now, for everyone on the call live today, you're going to receive a free 30-minute consultation from one of the Soukup Strategic Solutions consultants about your next steps following a natural disaster, or if there's something else you want to talk to them about. One of our colleagues is going to be reaching out to you to schedule that. We'll be sending you a survey shortly to see what you thought of the webinar. We've got more webinars on the way. Matter of fact, in January, we're going to do a webinar on boards, which is going to be great. Gee, Debra, I think I'm going to be calling you back real fast. Also, one other thing I did want to mention once again, we have our podcast that we do, IMPACTability. Just look for it wherever you listen to podcasts, whatever your favorite podcast server is, that's where you want to go. IMPACTability, and we cover so many great conversations and different topics in that in that podcast. If you haven't checked it out, love to have you check it out. Again, thank you to all of my colleagues, and thank you all for attending. Hope we provided you with some insight moving forward following a natural disaster. Thank you all for joining us today, and please stay safe.